You were taught to want before you knew what wanting meant. Before you could speak full sentences, they put a screen in your hand and told you the world was yours. Before you understood loss, they gave you everything, and in doing so, they took something you'll spend your whole life trying to find again. This is about the child who chased happiness too young and discovered that desire doesn't satisfy hunger, it multiplies it. And if you think you escaped this, you're about to realize you didn't. You just learned to hide it better. Let's start with something uncomfortable. When you were young, probably younger than you remember, someone made a choice for you. They decided that your happiness mattered more than your resilience, that your comfort was more important than your character. They gave you what you wanted instead of what you needed, and they did it because they loved you. But love without wisdom creates adults who mistake pleasure for peace, who confuse having with being, who spend decades chasing a satisfaction that moves further away with every step forward. The ancient Greeks had a word for this kind of life: hedon, pure pleasure, raw sensation. The immediate hit of dopamine that tells your brain you've won something even when you've lost. But here's what they understood that we've forgotten. Pleasure isn't the enemy. The problem is, when pleasure becomes the only language you speak, when you've been conditioned since childhood to measure your worth by how good you feel in any given moment, you become a slave to sensation. And slavery, even golden slavery, is still slavery. Think about the child in the grocery store, the one screaming for candy. The parent, exhausted and embarrassed, hands it over, peace is restored. The child learns, wanting loudly enough produces results. Do this enough times, across enough contexts, and you don't just create a difficult child. You architect an adult who believes the universe owes them satisfaction. An adult who will spend their 30s in therapy trying to understand why achievement feels empty, why relationships feel transactional, why nothing ever feels like enough. But we're not here to blame parents. We're here to excavate something deeper. To understand that hedonism, the philosophy of pleasure, isn't just about sex and drugs and mindless consumption. It's about the fundamental human instinct to move toward pleasure and away from pain. And when that instinct gets weaponized by a culture that profits from your dissatisfaction, you end up with something far more sinister than simple indulgence. You end up with a generation that mistakes comfort for happiness, distraction for peace, and accumulation for achievement. Epicurus, the philosopher most people misunderstand when they hear the word hedonism, actually warned against this. He didn't advocate for endless pleasure-seeking. He advocated for the removal of pain, which is a completely different thing. He understood that the happiest life isn't the one filled with the most intense pleasures, but the one with the fewest unnecessary pains. The life where you've learned to distinguish between the desires that serve you and the desires that own you. And if you've been resonating with this, maybe it's time to join the space where we go deeper every week. You know where the button is. Here's where it gets personal. When you were given everything you wanted as a child, you were robbed of something essential. The space between wanting and having, that gap, that tension, that delay, that's where character is built. That's where you learn that you can survive disappointment. That you can want something desperately and not get it and still be okay. That your worth isn't determined by your ability to acquire and consume and possess. But if you never experienced that gap, if every want was immediately satisfied, then you enter adulthood with a devastating handicap. You believe that desire should always be followed by gratification, that the uncomfortable feeling of wanting should be resolved as quickly as possible, so you buy things you don't need. You pursue relationships that aren't good for you. You chase promotions and achievements and external validation, thinking that the next hit of dopamine will finally be the one that lasts, but it never does. Because the problem isn't that you haven't found the right thing to want. The problem is that you were taught to chase wanting itself. Think about your phone. How many times today have you picked it up, not because you needed information, but because you needed stimulation? How many times have you scrolled through content you don't care about, looking for that little spark of novelty, that microdose of pleasure that tells your brain you're doing something worthwhile? This isn't an accident. This is hedonic engineering. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry built on the foundation of your childhood conditioning. They know that if you were raised to expect constant stimulation, you'll pay anything to maintain it. Now let's talk about what happens when this pattern extends into your relationships. When you were taught that your discomfort should always be resolved, you never learned how to sit with conflict, how to be uncomfortable in someone else's presence and not immediately try to fix it, leave it, or numb it. So your relationships become transactional. When someone doesn't make you feel good, you replace them. When love requires sacrifice or patience or the kind of deep, unglamorous work that doesn't produce immediate satisfaction, you interpret that as evidence that you're with the wrong person. You're not. You're just experiencing what love actually is, and it doesn't match the fantasy you were sold. The hedonic treadmill is real. Scientists have studied this. You get the thing you wanted, the new car, the new relationship, the new achievement, and you feel good for a while. Days, maybe weeks if you're lucky, then your baseline resets. The pleasure fades, and you're left exactly where you started, except now you need something bigger, better, newer to get the same hit. This is why people who win the lottery often end up miserable. Not because money is bad, but because they mistake the acquisition of money for the solution to their internal emptiness. And here's the dark part. You know this. On some level, you absolutely know this. You've experienced it dozens of times. You've bought the thing, felt the rush, then felt it fade. You've achieved the goal, celebrated for a moment, then immediately started looking for the next one. But you do it anyway. Because the alternative of sitting with yourself, with your unresolved wanting, with your fundamental dissatisfaction that feels unbearable. So you keep running, you keep consuming, you keep chasing. Not because you think it will work, but because you don't know what else to do. If this is landing somewhere deep, you might want to stick around. We're building something different here, and you're part of it. Let me tell you about the opposite approach. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, understood something that modern hedonism deliberately ignores. They understood that desire itself is the problem, not the object of desire, but the state of perpetual wanting. They practiced exercises designed to break the cycle. Negative visualization, where you imagine losing everything you have, so you can appreciate what you have now. Voluntary discomfort, where you deliberately experience cold, hunger, or inconvenience, so you realize you're stronger than your comfort requires. This isn't about becoming some ascetic who rejects all pleasure. It's about reclaiming your sovereignty. It's about recognizing that as long as your happiness depends on external acquisition, you'll never be free. You'll always be one disappointment away from despair. But when you can sit with wanting without needing to resolve it, when you can be uncomfortable without needing to escape it, when you can feel desire without being controlled by it, then you've stepped off the hedonic treadmill. You've stopped being a child, chasing candy, and become an adult who understands that peace isn't the presence of pleasure, it's the absence of neediness. But here's the thing, nobody tells you this transition is painful, deeply, profoundly painful, because it requires you to grieve, to mourn the fantasy that you were sold as a child. The fantasy that happiness is something you achieve, acquire, or arrive at. The fantasy that if you just work hard enough, want smart enough, optimize perfectly enough, you'll finally feel satisfied. You won't. That destination doesn't exist. And accepting that, truly accepting it, feels like death. Because in a way, it is. It's the death of the child who believed the world owed them happiness. Think about your last major purchase. The thing you convinced yourself you needed. Before you bought it, you probably spent time imagining how it would change your life. How you'd feel when you finally had it. And maybe for a day or a week, it did change something. But then it became just another object in your life. Another thing you own that doesn't own your attention anymore. This is the cycle. Anticipation, acquisition, adaptation, abandonment, and then the search begins again for the next thing that will surely, finally, actually satisfy you. Now, apply this to your career. How many times have you thought that the next promotion, the next achievement, the next level of success would be the one that makes you feel accomplished? And how many times have you reached that level and felt nothing, or worse? Felt anxious that you need to reach the next one before someone discovers you're not actually that impressive? This is hedonic adaptation in professional form. You're not climbing toward satisfaction. You're running on a treadmill that speeds up every time you think you're making progress. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said that life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. When we're suffering, we want relief. When we're comfortable, we want stimulation. We're never satisfied because satisfaction isn't a destination. It's a temporary pause between states of wanting. And if you were raised in an environment that never taught you how to sit in that pause, how to be with yourself without needing something, then you're doomed to spend your life swinging between those two poles, never quite landing anywhere that feels like home. You're still here, which means something in this is true for you. If you want more of this, you know what to do. Let's get specific about what this looks like in modern life. You wake up and immediately check your phone. Not because anything important happened while you slept, but because you need that hit of novelty, that sense that you're connected to something larger than your own consciousness. You scroll through social media, watching other people's curated lives, and you feel that familiar mixture of envy and inadequacy. So you post something, hoping for validation, hoping for those little hearts and comments that tell you you're seen, you're valued, you're enough. But the feeling fades almost immediately, and you're left refreshing the screen, hoping for more. This is hedonism in its most insidious form. Not the classical image of debauchery and excess, but the quiet, constant need for external validation and stimulation. You've been conditioned to believe that your emotional state should always be positive, always comfortable, always moving toward pleasure. So when you feel bored, anxious, lonely, or uncertain, you reach for something. Food, shopping, pornography, social media, work, exercise, whatever your particular drug of choice happens to be. Not because these things are inherently bad, but because you're using them to avoid the fundamental human experience of being with yourself, unmediated and unresolved. Here's what changed for me, and maybe this will land for you. I realized that I wasn't actually enjoying most of the pleasures I was chasing, I was consuming them. There's a difference. Enjoyment requires presence, attention, appreciation. Consumption is just the mechanical act of acquiring and moving on to the next thing. I wasn't tasting my food. I was eating while scrolling. I wasn't watching movies. I was half watching while checking my phone. I wasn't having conversations. I was waiting for my turn to talk while pretending to listen. I had become a machine designed to consume stimulation without ever actually being satisfied by it. And the worst part? I didn't even realize I was doing it, because this is what normal looks like now. This is what everyone around me was doing. We're all walking around in a state of constant, low-grade dissatisfaction, medicating it with an endless stream of minor pleasures that never quite work, but that we can't seem to stop pursuing. We've become a culture of hedonic zombies, chasing happiness so desperately that we've forgotten what it actually feels like to be content. The Buddhist tradition has a concept called tanha, which is often translated as craving or thirst. It's the root of suffering in their philosophical framework, not the specific things we want, but the state of wanting itself. The perpetual feeling that something is missing, that we're incomplete, that satisfaction is always just out of reach. And they understood something crucial. You can't satisfy tanha by giving it what it wants. You can only satisfy it by seeing through it. By recognizing that the craving isn't a signal that something's wrong with your life, it's a signal that something's wrong with your relationship to your life. When you were a child and you wanted something, crying loud enough usually worked. Someone came, someone helped, someone gave you what you needed, or at least what you wanted, but you're not a child anymore. Nobody's coming. And the things you're wanting now, the deep satisfactions, the sense of meaning, the feeling that your life matters, these aren't things that can be given to you by someone else. They have to be cultivated from within. And that cultivation requires exactly the thing you were never taught how to do. Sit with discomfort, be with wanting without needing to resolve it. Exist in the gap between desire and gratification, and discover that you're okay there. This might be exactly what you needed to hear today. If it is, consider staying for more. Let me tell you what happens when you start to break this cycle. At first, it's hell. Pure, distilled hell. Because you've spent your entire life building escape routes from discomfort, and now you're deliberately closing them off. You're sitting with boredom without reaching for your phone, you're feeling anxious without immediately trying to fix it, you're experiencing desire without acting on it, and your brain, which has been trained since childhood to expect immediate resolution, starts screaming at you. It tells you something's wrong. It tells you you're missing out. It tells you that everyone else is happy and you're broken for not being able to just enjoy things like a normal person. But if you can sit with that, if you can breathe through it and stay present with the discomfort, something shifts. The intensity of the craving starts to diminish. Not because the desire goes away, but because you realize that you can experience desire without being consumed by it. You can want something and not have it and be okay. You can feel empty and not immediately need to fill that emptiness with something, anything, just to make it stop. And in that space, that gap between stimulus and response that Viktor Frankl talked about, you find something you didn't even know you'd lost. Your freedom? This is what Epicurus actually meant by the hedonic life. Not endless pleasure-seeking, but the intelligent pursuit of sustainable contentment. He divided desires into 3 categories: natural and necessary, like food and shelter; natural but unnecessary, like gourmet food and luxury; and unnatural and unnecessary, like fame and power. And he argued that happiness comes from satisfying the first category, being moderate with the second, and avoiding the third entirely. Because the first category has a natural limit. You eat until you're full, then you stop. But the third category has no limit. You can never be famous enough, powerful enough, wealthy enough. The goalpost keeps moving because these desires aren't based on natural human needs. They're based on comparison, ego, and the endless attempt to prove your worth through external validation. Think about how much of your life is spent in that third category. How much energy you burn trying to impress people you don't even like. How many hours you work at a job that doesn't fulfill you just to maintain a lifestyle that doesn't make you happy? How many relationships you maintain not because they nourish you, but because ending them would be uncomfortable or would make you look bad? You're living someone else's idea of success, chasing someone else's definition of happiness, and wondering why it feels so empty. Here's the hardest truth I can give you. Your childhood conditioning isn't your fault, but your adult life is your responsibility. Nobody's going to give you permission to stop chasing. Nobody's going to tell you it's okay to want less, to be satisfied with what you have, to stop performing for an audience that isn't even paying attention. You have to give yourself that permission. And it's terrifying because it means accepting that maybe you've wasted years, maybe decades, chasing things that were never going to satisfy you. But that acceptance, painful as it is also liberation, because once you stop chasing, once you step off the treadmill and sit down in the middle of your actual life, you might discover something shocking. You might discover that you already have enough. Not that your life is perfect, not that there's nothing you want to change or improve or work toward, but that the desperate, cloying neediness that's been driving you, that voice that says you're incomplete and insufficient and need to acquire more before you're allowed to be happy, that voice is a liar. It was installed in you when you were too young to question it, and now, as an adult, you have the power to uninstall it. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, but it's possible. If you're finding value in this, maybe it's time to make it official. The button's right there. So what does this look like practically? How do you actually break a pattern that's been operating since before you could form memories? You start small, radically small. You practice sitting with minor discomfort without immediately resolving it. You feel hungry and you wait 30 minutes before eating. Not to punish yourself, but to prove to your brain that you can experience a want without being controlled by it. You feel bored, and instead of reaching for your phone, you just sit there. You let yourself be bored. You discover that boredom isn't actually dangerous, it's just uncomfortable, and discomfort is something you can survive. You practice saying no to yourself, not as deprivation, but as an exercise in sovereignty. You want to buy something? You wait a week. If you still want it after a week, maybe you buy it, maybe you don't. But the point isn't the purchase. The point is breaking the automatic connection between wanting and having. You're reprogramming yourself, teaching yourself that you're the one in control, not your desires. You start paying attention to the difference between pleasure and satisfaction. Pleasure is immediate and fleeting. Satisfaction is deep and lasting. Pleasure comes from consumption. Satisfaction comes from creation, contribution, connection. The problem with hedonic pursuit is that it maximizes pleasure while completely ignoring satisfaction. You can have a life full of pleasures and still feel profoundly empty because pleasure doesn't build anything, it just passes time. Satisfaction, on the other hand, comes from doing hard things, from delaying gratification, from building something that matters to you even when nobody else notices or cares. Think about the last time you felt genuinely satisfied. Not pleased, not entertained, not distracted, but deeply satisfied. It probably wasn't when you bought something or achieved something or got validation from someone. It was probably when you did something difficult and saw it through. When you helped someone who needed help, when you created something that reflected your actual values instead of your conditioned wants. That feeling, that's what you're actually looking for. And you've been trained to mistake it for pleasure, so you keep chasing the wrong thing. The Stoics had a practice called premeditatio malorum, which means premeditation of evils. Every day they would spend time imagining everything going wrong, losing their wealth, their status, their health, their loved ones. Not to be morbid or pessimistic, but to prepare themselves emotionally. To recognize that attachment to external things creates vulnerability. That if your happiness depends on circumstances beyond your control, then you're not actually happy, you're just comfortable, and comfort is temporary. This is the opposite of what you were taught as a child. You were taught to expect good things, to believe that if you were good enough, worked hard enough, wanted hard enough, the universe would give you what you deserved. But the universe doesn't care about fairness. Bad things happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people. The only thing you actually control is how you respond to what happens. And if you've built your entire identity around the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, then you're completely unprepared for the inevitable moment when life doesn't cooperate with your plans. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. And it's the foundation of a life that's actually resilient instead of just comfortable. When you practice sitting with discomfort, when you deliberately experience small disappointments and frustrations without immediately trying to fix them, you're building psychological muscles that most people never develop. You're training yourself to be okay when things aren't okay. And that skill, more than any achievement or acquisition or external validation, is what actually creates a life you can be proud of. Here's something nobody wants to hear. Most of your desires aren't actually yours. They're borrowed from the culture you grew up in. The house, the car, the career, the relationship status, the body type, the lifestyle. These aren't things you independently decided you wanted. These are things you were told you should want. And you absorbed that messaging so young and so completely that you can't tell the difference anymore between your authentic desires and your conditioned ones. And we're building something here for people who are ready to question everything. If that's you, subscribe. So how do you figure out which desires are actually yours? You ask a simple question. If nobody else ever knew about this, would I still want it? If the achievement, the acquisition, the accomplishment couldn't be posted, shared, or used to impress anyone, would you still pursue it? Most people, if they're honest, would have to admit that the majority of what they're chasing is performative. It's not about what they actually want. It's about what they think will make them look successful, happy, or worthy in the eyes of others. And here's where it gets really uncomfortable. Even the desire to be free from desire, even the pursuit of some kind of enlightened non-attachment, can become another form of hedonic striving.